A sleek, black car sliced through the city's arteries, a silent predator in a jungle of concrete and steel. Inside, Damon Blackwood was a king on his throne. His voice was a low, precise instrument carving up a multi-billion-dollar merger over a secure line. The margins are non-negotiable, Peterson. Squeeze them until they scream, then offer them a bandage. That's how we win. He didn't look at the cityscape blurring past his window. To him, it was just a board game he was dominating, a collection of assets and liabilities. His reflection in the tinted glass showed a man forged in pressure, sharp suit, sharper jawline, and eyes the color of a gathering storm, empty of everything but ambition. He was the undisputed master of his universe, a universe that was impeccably designed, ruthlessly controlled, and emotionally sterile. Then his universe shuddered. A lurch, a hiss, and the smooth glide of the luxury vehicle devolved into a graceless, bumpy halt. The driver, a man named George who was usually as stoic as the car's hood ornament, began to stammer. "Mr. Blackwood, sir? I apologize. It appears we have a flat tire." Damon ended his call with a clipped, "Handle it," the words a dismissal of both the billion-dollar deal and the man on the other end. Impatience, a hot and useless emotion, pricked at him. He was on a schedule, a timeline measured in millions per minute. He pushed open the heavy door and stepped out, the humid air of a forgotten city block clinging to his expensive suit. This wasn't his world. The buildings were older, the storefronts humbler, the air thick with the scent of street food and exhaust fumes. His gaze, accustomed to sweeping over boardrooms and financial reports, fell upon a small figure sitting on the steps of a worn-out brick apartment building. It was a little girl, no older than 6, her head bent in concentration over a sketchbook. A splash of bright yellow in a world of gray concrete. She was utterly absorbed, a tiny artist creating a world of her own. Damon was about to turn away, to hurry George along with a cutting remark, when the girl looked up. Her eyes met his. And the world stopped. It wasn't just the color, that unique, stormy gray that he saw in his own reflection every morning. It was the shape, the intensity, the ancient soulfulness that stared back at him. It was like looking at a photograph of himself as a child. Only this was real, breathing, and looking at him with open curiosity. The resemblance was not just striking. It was a physical blow, a mathematical impossibility that his mind scrambled to process and reject. A woman's voice called out, warm and gentle, "Lily, time to come inside, sweetie." A woman emerged from the building's doorway, her face etched with a familiar tiredness, but her smile for the child was radiant. Damon's breath caught in his throat. Elena. It was Elena. Older, yes, her features changed by time and hardship, but unmistakably her. The woman he had loved with a desperation that now felt like a ghost story from another man's life. The woman he had been forced to leave. Elena's eyes found him standing there, a statue in a bespoke suit, and all the color drained from her face. She looked as if she'd seen a ghost. The little girl, Lily, gathered her sketchbook and ran to her mother, her small hand finding Elena's. But before she disappeared inside, she turned back, her gaze fixed on Damon. She tilted her head, a gesture of innocent inquiry. "Mommy," she said, her small voice carrying across the pavement with perfect clarity. "He looks just like the man in your locket." The door clicked shut, leaving behind a silence that was louder than any boardroom shouting match. The words echoed in the space where she had been, rewriting his past, present, and future in a single, devastating sentence. George, oblivious to the cataclysm that had just occurred, spoke from beside him. "The spare is on, sir. We can go." Damon didn't hear him. He didn't feel the city air on his skin. His world, once a fortress of numbers and strategies, had been breached. The phone in his hand, a conduit to immense power and wealth, suddenly felt like a meaningless piece of plastic and glass. It slipped from his grasp, clattering onto the gritty sidewalk. He was frozen, his mind a maelstrom of shock and a single, terrifying, undeniable truth. He had a daughter. Back in the sterile silence of his penthouse, the city lights twinkling below like a galaxy he no longer belonged to, Damon was a ghost haunting his own life. The air was cool and filtered, the surfaces were polished marble and chrome, but he felt as if he were suffocating. He bypassed the bar, the sprawling sofa, the floor-to-ceiling windows, and went straight to his private study. In the bottom drawer of a massive oak desk, beneath files detailing corporate takeovers and hostile acquisitions, was a small, plain wooden box. His fingers trembled slightly as he lifted the lid. Inside, resting on faded velvet, was the entire history of his heart. A single photograph of him and Elena, their faces pressed together, radiating a joy so pure it was now painful to behold. He had been 25, she 23. They were standing on a pier, the wind whipping her dark hair across his face. He remembered the exact moment the photo was taken, the scent of salt in the air, the sound of her laughter. Beside the photo lay a pressed daisy, its petals fragile and brown, a relic of a day they had spent in a field dreaming of a future that had never come to pass. The memory of their end was a sharp, jagged thing in his chest. His father, Arthur Blackwood, a man who viewed emotion as a market liability, had summoned him to his cavernous office. The disapproval had rolled off him in waves. He called Elena a distraction, a common girl with ambitions, a gold digger who would dilute the Blackwood legacy. Arthur had presented the choice with the cold finality of a death sentence: end the relationship or be cut off from the family, the inheritance, and watch as Blackwood Industries systematically crushed Elena's father's small construction business. Damon, young and conditioned to believe his father's version of duty was the only one that mattered, had folded. He had written Elena a letter, its words cold and clinical, severing their connection without a real explanation. He had told himself it was to protect her family, a necessary sacrifice. Now, seeing the face of a little girl with his eyes, he understood it hadn't been a sacrifice. It had been a betrayal. The guilt was a physical weight pressing down on him, crushing the air from his lungs. The chime of the private elevator announcing a visitor ripped him from his reverie. He hastily closed the box and shoved it back in the drawer just as Isabella Vance swept into the room. She was the physical embodiment of his life, flawlessly beautiful, impeccably dressed, her smile a perfectly calibrated tool of social diplomacy. She was the daughter of his primary partner in the merger, a union that would consolidate two corporate empires. A perfect match on paper. "Darling," she said, her voice smooth as silk as she kissed the air beside his cheek. "You seem distracted. I hope you haven't forgotten the Vesper Gala tonight. We need to present a united front, especially with the final merger vote next week." She surveyed the room, her eyes missing the turmoil raging within him. "Don't let some triviality derail you, Damon. Our future is too important." Her words, meant to be supportive, now sounded like the bars of a cage clicking shut. The moment the elevator doors closed behind her, Damon was on his feet, pacing like a caged animal. Triviality. This was the antithesis of trivial. This was the most real thing that had ever happened to him. He snatched his phone and dialed a number he kept for only the most critical situations. "Marcus," he said, his voice tight. "I need you." Marcus Thorne was his head of security, a man whose loyalty was to Damon, not the Blackwood name. Before security, he had been one of the city's best private investigators. "I need you to find someone. Her name is Elena Flores. Last known address was in the Eastgate neighborhood." He rattled off the street where his car had broken down. "I need to know everything. Where she is, what she's doing, everything about her daughter, Lily. And Marcus," he added, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Absolute discretion. No one is to know about this. Not my father. Not Isabella. No 1 inch." As he waited for Marcus to work his magic, Damon was drawn back to the wooden box. He stared at the photograph again, his thumb tracing the outline of Elena's smiling face. Lily. A little girl with his eyes. A little girl who knew about a locket. Did Elena still wear it? After everything, after the cold letter he'd sent, was it possible she'd held on to some piece of him? A fragile, unfamiliar tendril of hope began to unfurl in the desolate landscape of his heart. It was a painful, terrifying sensation. Hope was an unpredictable variable, something he had long ago eliminated from his life's equation. The call came 26 hours later. It was faster than he'd expected, and the tone in Marcus's voice instantly extinguished the tiny flame of hope. It was heavy, grave. "Mr. Blackwood, I found them." Damon held his breath. "But sir, there's a complication." A pause stretched, thick with dread. "Elena, she passed away 2 years ago. Aneurysm." It was very sudden, the world tilted on its axis. Elena was gone. The chance to explain, to apologize, to beg for forgiveness, all of it had vanished. The pain was sharp and blinding. He sank into a chair, the phone slick in his hand. Marcus continued, his voice gentle but firm. "The little girl, Lily, she's being raised by her older sister, a woman named Clara Flores." Then came the final, devastating blow. "Sir, there's more. In her personal effects, there were copies of letters, printed out emails. All sent to you 7 years ago. They went to your old personal email account and P.O. box. The ones your father's personal assistant used to manage for you." The implication hung in the air, as clear and sharp as a guillotine's blade. His father hadn't just disapproved. He had actively conspired. He had intercepted Elena's messages, buried the truth, and stolen 7 years of his son's life. He had stolen a daughter. The news of Elena's death was a chasm that had opened at his feet. The revelation of his father's treachery was the shove that sent him plummeting into it. For a day, Damon did nothing. He canceled meetings, ignored calls from Isabella, and sat in his silent penthouse while a storm of grief and rage warred within him. He could deploy his army of lawyers, rain financial fire down on his father, and buy 1,000 community centers. But that was the old Damon's way. That was throwing money at a problem to make it disappear. This was different. This was not a problem to be solved. It was a life to be understood, a daughter to be known. He couldn't be a CEO swooping in to fix things. He had to be a man. Marcus had discovered that Clara Flores, Elena's sister and Lily's guardian, worked as the director of the very same place he had seen them disappear into, the Eastgate Community Center. A struggling nonprofit that ran on shoestring budgets and sheer force of will. Damon put on a pair of jeans he hadn't worn in a decade and a plain gray t-shirt. He left his watch, a piece of machinery worth more than the community center's entire annual budget, on his dresser. He drove himself, not in the sleek black sedan, but in a nondescript SUV from his security pool. He walked through the center's propped-open doors not as Damon Blackwood, the titan of industry, but as Dan, a man with time on his hands looking to volunteer. The reality of their world hit him with the force of a physical impact. The air inside was thick with the smell of cheap disinfectant, tempera paint, and hope. He saw Clara, her face a mask of exhaustion held together by fierce determination, patiently helping a young boy sound out the words in a book. Her hair was pulled back in a messy bun, and she wore a faded sweatshirt, but she moved with an authority that no boardroom could bestow. Then he saw Lily. She was sitting at a small table, her tongue sticking out in concentration as she carefully shared her small bag of pretzels with another child, ensuring they each got the exact same number. The stark, brutal contrast between this simple act of generosity and the lavish, wasteful galas he attended made him feel physically ill. A deep, hollowing guilt gnawed at him. He saw a bookshelf tilting precariously, its particle board warped and bowing under the weight of worn-out paperbacks. Without a second thought, he found a stray screwdriver in a janitor's closet and, with unfamiliar but determined hands, began to fix it. The simple, tangible act of mending something broken felt more meaningful than any merger he had ever closed. Lily, naturally, was drawn to the quiet, sad-eyed man fixing things. She approached him not with the caution of a city kid, but with the open-hearted curiosity of a child who had been raised with love. "Are you a builder?" she asked, watching him tighten the last screw. "Something like that," he replied, his voice rough with emotion. She deemed this an acceptable answer and asked if he could help her draw a castle. He sat with her at the small, paint-stained table, the scent of crayons and paper filling his senses. For the first time in years, he felt a flicker of something real, a connection that was both terrifying in its intensity and beautiful in its simplicity. He was acutely aware of Clara watching them. Her gaze was a tangible thing, sharp and suspicious. She was a lioness guarding her cub, and he was an unknown predator in her territory. "Why are you really here?" she asked him one afternoon, her voice low and direct, cutting through his Dan facade. "There are shinier places for men like you to do their charity work." He met her gaze, unable to lie but not yet able to tell the truth. "I needed to be somewhere real," he said, the words more honest than he intended. The fragile truce shattered a few days later. Lily was painting a vibrant, chaotic masterpiece, and in her enthusiasm she got a smear of stormy gray paint on the back of her hand. She held it up, a triumphant mess. Then her eyes widened as she looked from her hand to his face. She scrambled over and held her paint-smeared hand right next to his eyes, a look of profound discovery on her face. "Look," she exclaimed, her voice full of a child's pure wonder. "It's the same. Stormy gray. And Clara says that's what Mommy called the color of the eyes of the man in her locket." Time froze. Her words were not an accusation, just a statement of fact, but they landed like a judge's gavel. She looked at him then, her gaze shifting from his eyes to his expression, and her own face softened with an empathy far beyond her years. "You look so sad," she said softly. "Are you missing someone, too?" The direct, innocent question struck the very core of him, leaving him exposed and defenseless. Across the room, Clara, who had been watching the exchange, went rigid. The suspicion in her eyes hardened, a flicker of memory connecting the dots, her expression shifting from wariness to a dawning, horrified comprehension. She knew. Isabella Vance was not a woman who tolerated loose ends. She operated with the same ruthless efficiency in her social life as Damon did in his business. When she heard through the city's insidious gossip mill a whisper from a caterer who knew a driver who had seen Damon Blackwood's car in Eastgate, she felt a prickle of unease. Damon was pulling away, his excuses for missing dinners and calls becoming more frequent and less plausible. She did not like mysteries she was not in control of. She did what people like her always did, she hired someone to solve the problem. The private investigator was discreet and expensive. He returned in 2 days with a thin file of photographs. The images showed Damon dressed down in jeans kneeling on the floor of a shabby community center. In almost every photo, he was with a small, dark-haired girl. The final photo was a close-up of the child's face as she laughed up at him. And in her eyes, Isabella saw it. She saw Damon. A cold, calculated fury ignited within her. This child was not a triviality, she was a biological claim, a living, breathing threat to Isabella's meticulously constructed future. Meanwhile, Damon, reeling from Lily's innocent revelation and the dawning horror on Clara's face, knew the charade was over. He called Marcus, his voice urgent. "Dig deeper into my father. I want to know everything he did to Elena. Every threat, every phone call, every dirty trick. I want it all." The information Marcus uncovered was worse than Damon could have imagined. He found the original letters from Elena, scanned and saved on an old server by his father's now-retired assistant, a woman who had always harbored a quiet sympathy for Damon. One letter was a desperate, tear-stained plea written just weeks after the breakup. "Damon, please, you have to talk to me. I don't believe what you wrote. I love you. And Damon, I'm pregnant." The words leaped off the page, a cry for help that had been silenced for 7 years. Another file contained a scanned birth announcement with a tiny, grainy photo of a newborn Lily. His father had seen it. He had known, and he had buried it. The final file was the most damning, a record of a shell corporation funded by Blackwood Industries that had systematically underbid on contracts, driving Elena's father's business into bankruptcy just 6 months after the breakup. It was a vicious, targeted attack. Arthur hadn't just threatened to ruin them, he had followed through with chilling precision. Damon knew he couldn't hide anymore. He owed Clara the truth. He called her and asked to meet, his voice heavy with a gravity she now understood. He met her at a small, neutral coffee shop halfway between their two worlds. Before he could even begin his rehearsed speech, she spoke, her voice low and trembling with suppressed rage. "I know who you are, Mr. Blackwood. I looked you up after what Lily said. You're him. You're the man who destroyed my sister." Her accusation was a clean blade, and he didn't try to parry it. "Yes," he said, his own voice cracking. "But I didn't know." He slid a folder across the table. Inside were the copies of Elena's letters, the proof of the Shell Corporation, the entire sordid history of his father's deception. "He kept it from me?" Damon said, the shame and anger making his voice raw. "He kept my daughter from me." Clara stared at the papers. Her sister's familiar handwriting. The cold, corporate proof of a vendetta she never knew existed. Tears welled in her eyes. Tears of grief for her sister, for her father, for the years of struggle. But as she looked up at Damon, she saw past the billionaire. She saw a man who had also been a victim of Arthur Blackwood's cruelty. She saw the genuine anguish in his stormy gray eyes. In that moment, a fragile, dangerous alliance was forged in their shared pain and their shared enemy. Isabella, however, was not one to wait for her enemies to act. Seeing the bond forming between Damon and this unknown child, she decided to escalate. She made a call to her family's lawyer, a man skilled in the dark arts of legal manipulation. Days later, a stern-faced woman from Child Protective Services appeared at the community center. She carried a clipboard and a formal notice of investigation. The complaint, filed anonymously, cited unstable living conditions, inadequate guardianship, and, most pointedly, the child's association with unknown adult males of questionable character. The threat was clear, direct, and terrifying. They weren't just trying to scare him off anymore. They were coming for Lily. The sight of the official CPS notice in Clara's trembling hands was the spark that ignited the bonfire of Damon's rage. The calculated cruelty of it, using a child as a pawn, severed the last thread of filial duty or past affection he might have felt. Armed with the full, damning file from Marcus and the fresh hell of Isabella's attack, he drove to the heart of his father's empire, the top floor of the Blackwood Industries tower. He bypassed the executive assistant, strode through the massive double doors and found them exactly as he'd pictured, Arthur Blackwood and Isabella Vance sitting at a polished mahogany table reviewing the final press strategy for the merger announcement. They looked up, surprised by his unannounced entrance. Damon didn't waste time on pleasantries. He threw the folder onto the table. The intercepted letters from Elena slid across the polished surface, coming to a rest directly in front of his father. "You knew," he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it was filled with a cold, lethal quiet that silenced the room. "All this time, you knew I had a daughter." Arthur Blackwood, a man who had faced down hostile takeovers and market crashes without flinching, looked at the letters and then at his son. There was no remorse in his eyes, only a chilling pragmatism. "I did what was necessary," he stated, his voice as hard as granite. "I did it to protect this family, to protect our legacy from a costly entanglement. That girl and her mother were a threat to everything we've built." Isabella, seeing her cue, stepped forward, placing a perfectly manicured hand on Damon's arm. "He's right, darling," she cooed, her voice a venomous syrup. "We have a perfect future ahead of us. Don't let this unfortunate mistake from your past ruin everything. We can handle it. A trust fund, a new home in another state. We can make them disappear quietly." The cold, transactional way she spoke of his daughter, of Clara, as if they were a line item on a balance sheet to be managed, was the final, irrevocable break. Damon shook her hand off as if it were a spider. "This family? This legacy?" he repeated, his voice finally rising, thick with a disgust so profound it felt like it was choking him. "This legacy is a monument to lies, cruelty, and fear. It's rotten to the core. And you," he said, turning the full force of his fury on Isabella, "are just as rotten as he is." He looked her dead in the eye. "The wedding is off. The merger is cancelled. As of this moment, every agreement between our families is null and void. You will not come near me, and you will not come near my daughter ever again." He then turned back to his father, the man who had shaped his entire life. "And you," he said, the words tearing from him with the pain of amputation. "You are no longer my father. I am calling an emergency board meeting. I'm removing you. I will spend the rest of my life and every penny of my fortune dismantling the corrupt empire you built on the wreckage of other people's lives." He left them there, stunned into silence in their glass tower, and drove straight back to Eastgate. He found Clara in her small, meticulously clean apartment, the CPS notice lying on the kitchen table like a death sentence. She was pale, her eyes wide with a terror that made him ache. He didn't wait. He told her everything. The confrontation, the cancelled wedding, his declaration of war against his father. He laid his entire plan bare. "I know I have no right to ask for your trust," he said, his voice raw with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. "I know the pain I caused Elena is unforgivable, but Lily is my daughter. I will not fail her. I will not fail you. Let me protect you both." He gestured to the expensive-looking woman in a business suit waiting discreetly by his car. "That is Eleanor Vance, no relation to Isabella, the best family law attorney in the state. She's here to fight this for us." Clara looked from Damon's desperate, pleading face to the powerful lawyer waiting outside. For the first time, she saw him not as the ghost who had haunted her sister's memory, but as a fierce, determined father ready to burn down the world to protect his child. She took a deep, shuddering breath and gave a single, decisive nod. "Okay," she whispered, the words sealing their alliance. "Okay, we'll fight them together." The Blackwood Foundation Charity Gala was the crown jewel of the city's social calendar, a night where the powerful and wealthy gathered to congratulate themselves on their philanthropy. Arthur and Isabella, reeling from Damon's declaration, decided to proceed with the event. It was their last, desperate gambit to control the narrative, to paint Damon as emotionally unstable and to salvage their reputations before the inevitable corporate implosion. They expected him to be hiding, licking his wounds. They did not expect him to show up. Damon arrived not through the main entrance but through a side door, slipping into the gilded ballroom just as his father was preparing to take the stage. He wasn't wearing a tuxedo. He was dressed in a simple, dark suit that made him stand out in the sea of black ties and sequins. On either side of him were Clara, her expression a mixture of terror and resolve, and Lily, clutching his hand, her wide eyes taking in the cavernous room and the glittering chandeliers. A wave of gasps and whispers rippled through the crowd as they recognized him. Arthur, momentarily faltering, quickly regained his composure. He stepped up to the podium, the lights glinting off his silver hair. "Friends, colleagues," he began, his voice resonating with false sincerity. Tonight, we celebrate a legacy of progress. And in that spirit of looking toward the future, it is with a heavy heart that I must announce my son, Damon, will be stepping down from his duties at Blackwood Industries for personal health reasons he didn't get to finish. Damon began walking calmly toward the stage, each step deliberate and sure. The crowd parted before him like the Red Sea. He stepped onto the stage, took the microphone from his father's stunned hand, and faced the city's elite. "My father is right about one thing," Damon said, his calm voice carrying to every corner of the ballroom, silencing the murmurs. "I am stepping down from a part of my life, the part that was built on his lies behind him. The massive screen that was supposed to be showing a promotional video for the foundation flickered to life. Projected in enormous, undeniable clarity was the first letter Elena had sent him. Her handwriting, full of desperate love and shocking news. Damon told them everything. He told them of the love he was forced to abandon, of the child he never knew he had. He told them of his father's systematic deception, projecting each intercepted letter, each piece of evidence for the entire room to see. The story unfolded, a melodrama of stolen love and hidden truths that held the powerful audience captive. Then he delivered the final, devastating blow, a piece of information Marcus had only uncovered in the last 48 hours. "My father didn't just hide my daughter from me," Damon said, his voice ringing with cold fury. "He actively and maliciously destroyed her grandfather's business, driving him to an early grave from the stress and the shame. He did it out of pure, calculated spite." A collective gasp went through the room. He then turned his attention to Isabella, who stood frozen by her table, her face a mask of horror. "And my ex-fiancée, when she discovered the truth, didn't try to right this wrong. Instead, she chose to perpetuate the cruelty. She filed a fraudulent and malicious child services complaint against a loving, dedicated guardian, weaponizing the state to terrorize a child for her own financial gain." The proof, an email from her lawyer confirming her instructions, flashed onto the screen. The fallout was instantaneous and absolute. The gilded ballroom descended into a stunned, tomb-like silence, broken only by the frantic clicking of reporters' keyboards. Board members and business partners stared at Arthur Blackwood with expressions of pure disgust. The man's reputation, carefully cultivated over a lifetime, had been immolated in under 10 minutes. At that moment, as if on cue, 2 uniformed police officers whom Damon's legal team had contacted with evidence of the fraudulent CPS filing entered the ballroom. They walked calmly and purposefully toward the stage, their presence a stark symbol of real-world consequences invading this fantasy palace. They approached Arthur and a now sobbing Isabella, their quiet words inaudible but their intent perfectly clear. The public humiliation was complete. Amid the controlled chaos, Damon turned his back on the wreckage of his former life. He stepped away from the microphone and knelt down, bringing himself to eye level with Lily. She had been shielded from the worst of it by Clara, but her small face was filled with confusion. He looked at his daughter, his heart overflowing with a painful, beautiful mix of regret and boundless love. "Lily," he said, his voice soft and thick with emotion, meant only for her. "I'm your father." He didn't know what to expect: fear, confusion, rejection. Instead, he felt a small, reassuring hand on his shoulder. It was Clara, her eyes shining with tears as she gave him a small, supportive nod. In front of hundreds of witnesses, under the glare of the society lights, Damon gently wrapped his arms around his daughter and held her for the very first time. A camera flash illuminated the scene, a tableau of a dynasty's downfall and the birth of a real family. 12 months later, the world was a different place. The scene was not a penthouse overlooking the city, but a sun-drenched backyard of a comfortable home in a quiet, tree-lined suburb. Damon, dressed in faded jeans and a plain t-shirt, was on his hands and knees in the dirt, a smudge of soil on his nose. He was laughing, a deep, genuine sound that seemed to come from a place long dormant, as he and Lily carefully placed marigold seedlings into a small garden plot. The cold, ruthless CEO was a ghost, a memory of another man. In his place was a father, his face relaxed and open, the constant tension that had once pulled his features taut completely gone. He looked younger, happier, more alive than he had ever been in a boardroom. Clara emerged from the house carrying a pitcher of lemonade, a comfortable, easy smile on her face. She and Damon shared a look that spoke of 1,000 shared moments, of building a new life together brick by brick. Through their casual conversation, it became clear what Damon's new legacy was. After dismantling the most predatory divisions of Blackwood Industries, he had poured the entirety of his personal fortune into a new charitable trust, the Elena and Lily Foundation. It was a massive non-profit dedicated to funding community centers like the one where they'd met, providing free legal aid to single parents fighting unjust systems and creating scholarships for children who had started life with the deck stacked against them. The Eastgate Community Center was now a brand new, state-of-the-art facility, a beacon of hope named in Elena's honor. Lily, her task complete, ran over and threw her arms around both of their necks in a triumphant group hug. "I love our garden," she declared happily. Over the top of his daughter's head, Damon's eyes met Clara's. The love he felt for them both was a warm, steady light inside him. He reached into his pocket. He didn't pull out a diamond the size of a quail's egg. He pulled out a simple, braided ring made from blades of grass, a fragile, perfect circle he and Lily had woven together that morning. "Clara," he began, his voice thick with an emotion that still felt new and precious. "We built this. This home, this family. We made it out of the ashes of something so broken. Will you make it official?" His stormy gray eyes, once empty, were now full of hope and a humble plea. "Will you marry me?" Tears of pure happiness welled in Clara's eyes, sparkling in the afternoon sun. She didn't hesitate. She smiled, a radiant expression of peace and love. "Yes," she whispered. "Of course, yes." Lily let out a whoop of joy, a sound of pure childhood delight. Damon pulled them both into a tight embrace, burying his face in his daughter's hair, his heart finally, completely full. He had spent a lifetime chasing power and a legacy carved in stock prices and steel towers. He had been wrong. His true legacy wasn't something to be built or acquired. It was here, in this small, sunlit garden, covered in dirt and rooted in a love that was real and everlasting.